What if there was a game where the player used music to interact with the world? This is probably along the lines of what the game developers at Hanging Gardens Interactive asked themselves. The game they came up with is Sonority. It was released in 2022, although I only recently discovered it. I was blown away by the way the music and the gameplay interact to create some really engaging puzzles and a fascinating story. Since the music is so integrated into the gameplay, I want to take a moment to talk about the game itself before diving into some musical analysis. In the game, you play as Esther, a girl who can talk to animals. She is friends with a bear who told her many times about the special place where humans and animals interacted through the language of music. The bear has fallen ill, so Esther journeys to these musical ruins in search of a special melody to cure him. Here, she meets a raccoon who gives some clues along the way. If this sounds corny to you, it's really not. As you explore the world, you discover tidbits about what went wrong and why the place is now in ruins. For me, the developers created the perfect amount of suspense where I was left intrigued and wanting to know more about the story. I wanted to solve the puzzles not only for the sake of solving them, but to unlock new areas and learn more about what happened. The game is fairly simple. It takes place in a 3D space, but the auto camera makes it very accessible to the inexperienced gamer. Throughout the game, you collect different instruments, and you use notes on the instruments to interact with objects in the world. Mostly, this is moving boxes around to reach different areas. The interval between the notes determines how far an object will move, and the direction of the interval determines the direction of the object's movement. For moving things up and down, this was fairly simple, as playing a C up to E, for instance, would move the object up, whereas playing an E down to C moves the object down. There is also rotational movement, where an interval moving up moves the object clockwise, and an interval down counterclockwise. I'm sure there was logic to the distance of an interval to how far an object rotates, but I mostly used trial and error for these. It wasn't until the late game puzzles that I had to sit down and really think about how the objects were moving, and almost ended up writing some things down, but I was eventually able to get it without doing that. Since this is a puzzle game, I appreciated that increase in difficulty. A really cool feature of the game is that as you solve the puzzles, the notes keep playing as you walk through the world, creating the game's soundtrack. Additionally, as you move through the world among the different elements of the music, the one you are closest to is always the loudest, making for a really immersive experience. That's the main gameplay. There are sometimes interactions with the raccoon that involve speaking, but you don't really have options for dialogue or anything like that. There are also these shiny diamond-shaped things called musical elements that you can find throughout the world. They are sometimes in plain sight and sometimes hidden in weird places, and sometimes you have to move the objects in different ways to reach them. They are used to unlock story elements and tips, but you really only need a handful to unlock the whole game, and I kind of wish there was more use for the rest. Other than that, my only complaint is that the controls were challenging at times. Granted, this is probably not an issue with the PC version. I played the Switch version, and I like what they tried to do, it just got confusing. Each note on your instrument is a different button, so you can start to feel like you're playing the instrument. However, it was difficult to get used to the logic of the buttons, and when you get more instruments, the note names and buttons change. For instance, I used the left bumper to play the note D on the panpipes, but when I switched to the kalimba, the note of that button is now E, because it's the second highest note the instrument can play. I think the PC version just uses number keys, which would make it a lot easier to keep track of. Still, since you don't have to rapidly hit notes, this wasn't too much of an issue with playability, and I do like what they were going for with a different button for each note, to make it feel kind of like an instrument. This game is really quite pretty. The environments are beautiful and the ruins are quite intriguing. There's a little bit of glitch as I move through the environments, but I suspect that was probably a Switch port issue, since that's a common issue with Switch ports. But again, I haven't played the PC version, so I don't know if it's also like that there. And again, this doesn't really affect the playability at all. The game is fully voice acted in German and English. I did not try the game in German, although I suspect the voice acting might be a little better than the English. Honestly, I've heard worse, and for the budget and scale of the game, the voice acting really is fine. I also think it would have been perfectly fine to just not have it at all. Most of the music is created by you, the player, as you solve puzzles. There is also this part of the game that is strictly for composing. In fact, the game even tells you there is no practical application whatsoever to this area, so you don't spin your gears trying to figure out why it's there. I think it's really cool that the developers program this whole area to just encourage creativity. When you arrive, there's a lovely melody playing over a simple note progression underneath. It's not really a chord progression because it's a single note, although it functions as one. When you first arrive, you won't have all the pitches you need to match a lot of the notes that are already in the melody, but by the end of the game, it's fun to come back and really make something pretty. Here's the original. And here's what I came up with. You can mess with the harmony notes, but I really liked what they had, so I just left that part alone. I love the visuals of the rhythm in this area too. Rhythm in the game is determined by how far apart the nodes are from each other, and there are even bar lines on the ground. This particular area is the only one that allows for eighth note rhythms, so it's fun to experiment with some syncopation and such. I've thought a lot about how this game could be used from a teaching standpoint. The repetition of intervals and the fact that it gives you auditory and visual cues shows potential for ear training. There are even these music boxes that ask you to recall pitches. You can figure them out through a process of elimination, but it still requires some level of pitch recall. Obviously, you would need more than just this game to truly train the ear, but it might be a fun little supplemental thing for a student. So that's basically all the elements of this fun little game called Sonority. Now, as promised, let's talk more about the music. There is one in-game area where I want to dive into some musical analysis. This area is called the Valley of Stones, and you reach it about a quarter of the way through the game. When you arrive, you have to wake up a stone statue, who in turn opens the door into the valley by humming. As you progress through the area, you wake up more stone statues, and their humming overlaps with the marimba melodies you unlock from solving puzzles. These elements combine to form the accompaniment to a final vocal melody, with lyrics in German, that starts after you wake up the final statue. A transcription of this song is shown here. Since this is such an immersive experience, I want to take a closer look at how each layer unfolds to create a tonal center leading to the final song. When you wake up each statue, you can play any note you'd like. For the first one, I chose to play a D because the stone will then hum a D back at you. This D is a very frequent note throughout the song. The statue's humming opens the first door so you can proceed further into the valley. Each consecutive door opens the same way, but it gets increasingly complicated to reach the statues, which is where the marimba puzzles come in. After you solve the puzzle to reach the second statue, it hums a G, which is a perfect fourth higher than the first statue's D. So I screwed up the ordering a little bit on that. The statue actually sings a D back at you, but you can hear in the distance the first statue singing a G afterwards. So you still get that D to G relationship. It's just not the first note you hear from that second statue. D is the dominant or 5 of G, and that motion up a perfect fourth normally signals a dominant up to tonic relationship between pitches. At this point, then, it seems like we might have a G key center, but it's still much too early to tell. Once you complete the next puzzle, the first of the repeating marimba parts from the final song is unlocked. The rest of the puzzles will make up the rest of this continuous line from the final song. Once you reach the third statue, it sings the note C. The addition of the note C with the repeating G and D from the other statues suggests we might actually have a C key center, and that G is actually the dominant. But again, it's still too early to tell. At this point, the mode is even more difficult to determine. So far, the interactions between the notes D, G, and C have only created perfect intervals. Without major and minor third relationships, it's impossible to really determine a mode. By the end of the next puzzle, however, the statue hums in E, which harmonizes with the previous statue C, creating our first major third interval. Here, we are finally getting a sense of tonality. The addition of this major third C to E suggests C major as a strong possibility for key center. This makes a lot of sense, considering one can only play white key notes on the instruments provided by the game, and C major only uses white keys, that is, no sharps or flats. However, the game designers do not relegate themselves to no accidentals for the parts of the music that the player does not create with the game's instruments. At the end of the next puzzle, for instance, the statue sings a B flat. This B flat is harmonized with a D from one of the other statues that resolves up to that C and E major third. This B flat to C motion sets the stage for a mode other than major or minor. C major should have a B natural resolving up to C to get the half-step leading tone resolution. Here, with the B flat up to C, we have a whole step. This new development suggests we are actually in C mixolydian instead of C major. Mixolydian is a mode very similar to major that is often used in folk music and different popular traditions like blues and rock. C mixolydian is very close to C major, sharing all pitches except the B flat and many of the same chords. The whole step resolution from the 7th scale degree back to 1, rather than the half step, gives a sort of gentler, less aggressive feeling to the music. That, combined with the gentle humming and marimba tones, creates a serene kind of atmosphere which lets the player know these singing stones, while odd, are not malicious in any way. By the time you reach the last puzzle, there is quite a bit going on musically. Most of the marimba line is filled in, as is the humming. If we just stand and listen for a minute, you will notice there are just a couple of gaps left in the music. Once you solve the final puzzle, you follow some stairs up to a larger, feminine-looking statue. You wake up this statue as you woke up the others, but unlike the others, she sings a lovely little melody that unlocks the note G for you to play.
L'amore
eyes get heavy and she seems to go back to sleep. However, through that encounter, you find after descending the stairs that you woke up the remaining statues in the valley, who now sing the top vocal line. As you make your way back through the valley, you can hear all of the marimba parts coming together to create a single line, and whichever part you're closest to will sound the loudest, suggesting that Esther is hearing everything that you're hearing in-game.
Schon seit einer Ewigkeit ertönt kein Gesang, geschweige denn ein unbekannter Klang. Graues Moos, schroffer Fels, verbitterter Stein.
And that's how we get to the full score here. The song is in German, which I think is really cool. It was a German company that made the game, and a later song you unlock is in English, but I like that they embraced their native tongue for this one. Since my German is elementary at best, I'm not sure what the words are. A few of the words I was able to pick up are in the score to help you track the parts. Let's take a closer look at each line in the score. The humming statue bass line is on the bottom. It is a series of one 4-measure phrase made up of whole notes that repeats 4 times. And incidentally, we are also in 4/4. Lots of 4s here. From just this bottom line, we can start to derive some sense of the harmonies. The second and third measures, for instance, show B-flat major and C major chords. As we are considering this work in C mixolydian, that is the major 7-to-1 motion I was talking about earlier. Measure 1 and 4 are ambiguous, with only a single D in the first measure and an open fourth D to G in the fourth measure. When considering all the notes from all 3 lines, we can derive some potential chords for measures 1 and 4. But unlike the clearly repeating B-flat and C major chords, the other lines change up these harmonies each time the bass progression repeats. See, for instance, how the very first measure could potentially be a D major or D minor chord, but the 5th measure, which includes the F in the vocal line, is more clearly D minor. The open-ended ambiguity from the lack of concrete chords adds to the ambiance of the area. I think it fits with the lyrics, although again, I couldn't catch all of it. The one word that stood out to me was warum, which means why. I'm not sure what follows the why, but it seems like a curious question rather than a malicious one, as the music is also curious, not wanting to conform strictly to any key or progression, but remaining a bit open-ended, like this question. Speaking of those other lines, let's take a closer look at the marimba line. This is again the line you unlock by solving the puzzles. Because of that, it is limited to the pitches you can play on your panpipes in-game. This includes the G you unlock at the end of this area. This line features a consistent rhythmic ostinato of quarter note, half note, quarter note, which follows the spacing of the stones in each puzzle. Furthermore, all of the pitches used to create this counter melody are the ones used to move the blocks and reach each statue. The whole design of this blows my mind. I'm really curious if the developers wrote the melody first and then designed the game around it, or vice versa. Regardless, the level of complexity to create this full song with the gameplay is really quite impressive. This middle line fills in some of the missing notes to create full chords with the bass line, and also adds some confusion to the harmonies. For instance, measure 2 fills in the F to create a full B-flat major chord, set up by the B-flat and D in the bass line. However, let's look again at that first measure. I said earlier this measure could possibly be D major or D minor, except there's this half note C in the marimba line that makes the harmony very confusing. The E on the 4th beat also does not fit into a D major or minor chord. All these pitches together don't really add up to anything meaningful in terms of chords. This is again creating that harmonic ambiguity. I only said that it was a D chord in the first place because that bass note happens to be a D. Furthermore, the rhythmic ostinato in this line, with the half note starting on beat 2, creates an emphasis on that beat, which is a rarity in 4/4 time. Normally, we would expect beats 1 and 3 to be important. The vocal line also emphasizes beat 2, with each 4-measure phrase beginning on the second beat of a measure. The emphasis on beat 2 puts the music a little askew and adds to the mystery. Let's now look more closely at that vocal line. It starts on beat 2, as I mentioned, and it has a lot of syncopation. The syncopation floats nicely above the other 2 lines, however, since they are so steady rhythmically. The vocal line has a very narrow range of less than an octave, with the highest note G appearing in measure 12, and the lowest note B flat right before the final 7/1 cadence in measure 14. Now let's consider all the lines together. Because this piece starts looping as soon as you wake up the first statue, although all you have to go off of is that statue's D, it is hard to determine where the beginning and end are without considering some music theory. I chose to set it up with Warum as the opening because of the cadences in the last line. In this last line, we have a half cadence in measure 12, followed by an imperfect authentic cadence from measure 14 into 15. A half cadence means the phrase ends on the dominant or 5 chord. In this case, we're not sure if it's major or minor 5 since we only have the notes G and D. The chord is also inverted since the D is on the bottom, so it does not necessarily feel or sound like a strong half cadence. Nevertheless, the emphasis on G, notice there is a G in every line here, gives it at least some semblance of that dominant half cadence sound. An imperfect authentic cadence is a dominant chord resolving to the 1 chord. In order for it to be a perfect authentic cadence, the dominant chord must be a 5 chord in root position with a few other stipulations that I won't bother going into here. In this case, the dominant chord is a major 7 resolving to 1. The final B flat to C motion is why I have the piece ending here. We see that motion elsewhere in the bass line as discussed earlier, but this is the only place where the vocal line ends with that motion. Thus, this cadence sounds like a logical ending before the next measure moves up to a unison D that takes us back to the beginning so the piece can loop endlessly. Let's listen to that so hopefully you can hear what I mean.
Geschweige denn ein unbekannter Klang. Graues Moos, schroffer Fels, verwitterter Stein.
Now let's go ahead and listen to the whole piece. Listening for the solid foundation of the humming statues, the emphasis on beat 2 in the melody and marimba line, that syncopation in the vocal line, and those ambiguous harmonies.
Warum muss man hier nur so allein sein? Schon seit einer Ewigkeit ertönte kein Gesang, geschweige denn ein unbekannter Klang. Graues Moos, schroffer Fels, verwitterter Stein.
So that is just a taste of the game Sonority. If you haven't played it, I highly recommend picking it up. It is available on Steam and will run on both PC and Mac. If your computer has at least 2 gigabytes of RAM, you can play this game. It's also available on the Switch. If you like music and puzzles, I highly recommend playing through the whole game. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please like and subscribe if you liked it and want to see more from me. And thank you all so much for watching. Hello again. If you like this format of game review and music analysis, I'd love to hear from you. And if you have a favorite indie game with some kick-ass music, leave a comment and maybe I'll take a look and do another one of these kinds of videos.